Let's get started. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Derek Hyra. I'm the director of the Metropolitan Policy Center. This is part of our urban speaker series. And this semester we have three gentrification scholars that are studying different parts of the United States. And I'm so glad that Amanda Boston is with us today. So she's going to be talking about Brooklyn. Dr. Boston is an assistant professor in the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research, writing, and teaching focuses on 20th century and contemporary African-American urban history, politics, and culture. Her book project, The New New York, I like that. I got the new urban renewal. You want the new New York?
It's a derivative text.
Yeah, I like that. The New New York, Race, Space, and Power in Gentrifying Brooklyn explores how race operates on gentrification or of gentrification in her hometown, and she's from Brooklyn. So it's not often that people actually come back to where they grew up to study, and I'm sure she's going to tell us a little bit why and how it's going for her in Brooklyn. But her book project is going to be the focus of this presentation. And Dr. Boston has articles in addition to books on Brooklyn and other places, but she's also received several prestigious research funding grants from places including the Ford Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. So she's got all the foundations throwing her money. So she's paying for dinner tonight, right? Is that how it goes? Not at all. We're hosting. Her pedigree in terms of where she got her degrees, she got her PhD and MA in African Studies from Brown University, and her MA in Political Science and the BA in Political Science in Africana and African American Studies from Duke University. So please help me welcome Amanda Boston to American University.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, cool. So thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. I have to shout out Derek Hyra for the invitation, Christian Whisker for keeping things moving seamlessly behind the scenes. As I was saying earlier, I'm not very good with email, but Christian stuck with me. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to be here with you all. And I'm grateful for the invitation to share my work. So as Professor Hyra mentioned, my remarks today are largely drawn from my book in progress, which is tentatively titled The New New York, Race, Space, and Power in Gentrifying Brooklyn. I'm a New Yorker to the heart, so I'm gonna try to slow down my speech a bit, but I know I'm moving very quickly. So I focus on the process's impact among Black residents of historically Black neighborhoods in my hometown of Brooklyn, New York. And there we find a scale of gentrification that's new and different than what we've seen in previous eras, as well as many forms of community resilience and resistance. And I'm looking forward to a lively and engaging question and answer session. So thank you in advance for listening. Now, as people mostly living and working in and around a dynamic city like Washington, D.C., right? Once chocolate, now cappuccino city, right? I expect that all of you have heard the term gentrification, but I want us to start with a baseline, bare bones definition of the process so we can begin with a common understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about gentrification. So in 1987, sociologist Sharon Zukin, who has frequently written about New York City, gave a broad definition of gentrification that's often kind of referenced today. And that's simply that gentrification is the conversion of socially marginal and working class areas of the central city to middle class residential use. So my work builds on this foundational understanding by dealing with several important changes gentrification has undergone. So first, the scope and scale of gentrification have changed immensely since the 70s, and of course, also since Zukin came up with her definition in the late 80s. And they've really accelerated at an unprecedented speed in the 21st century. So gentrification has grown from a small scale, mostly local occurrence. Think about, rehabbing an old brownstone if you're in New York, to one that seems to be everywhere, and it's tied to global processes of urban economic, political, spatial, and racial restructuring. As a result, the extent of its consequences for cities across the world and their residents has grown in magnitude as well. Scholars have analyzed the class politics of neoliberalism and how its attendant policies of privatization, deregulation, and austerity have shaped the contours of urban redevelopment, including the transformations we associate with gentrification. So in many areas of society, those measures have devastated poor and working class communities and widened already staggering levels of income and wealth inequality. And finally, as gentrification has spread deeper into majority-minority neighborhoods, the racial dimensions of these changes have become more apparent. So across urban America, including, of course, Brooklyn, DC, and so on, areas in which racially discriminatory housing and economic policies have concentrated Black residents, places which have long been condemned as blighted and unsuitable for capital investment, have become prime targets for redevelopment through increased private investment. But rather than address the enduring and oft expressed needs of existing Black, poor, and other marginalized communities, efforts at revitalization have tended to prime their neighborhoods for wider and more affluent residents and consumers. So gentrification's speedy and vicious uprooting of longtime residents, its erasure of local histories, and destruction of social networks and community institutions raises questions about the fundamental inequalities of capitalist property markets, right? But compounded by Black residents' disproportionate experiences with eviction, foreclosure, hyperpolicing, subprime lending, property theft, seizure, and other racialized forms of displacement and destabilization, these dynamics also illuminate vulnerabilities and power imbalances that can't be explained by class alone. But still, much of the gentrification scholarship, as well as sort of popular discourse and understandings of the process, only looks at racial inequality as an unfortunate outcome rather than a foundational tenet of urban development and redevelopment. And so that is, of course, if it reckons with race and power at all. So in my work, I foreground what I call the indelible imprint of race and structural racism in the organization of urban space and society. And specifically, I link histories of race and structural racism in Brooklyn and the rise of neoliberalism and colorblind racial ideology to the cumulative vulnerabilities of the borough's Black communities. My water somewhere. Thank you. So appreciate you. Thank you. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Brooklyn. So Brooklyn has been a really compelling site for examining all these dynamics in action. You've got the growing speed and viciousness of urban development, the entrenchment of neoliberal urbanism, and the racial dimensions of gentrification. And while many people recognize the borough as the symbolic gentrification capital of the world, what many don't know is that Brooklyn is actually the demographic and political center of Black life in New York City, right? A lot of folks still think of Harlem when they think of Black New York, and so I'm trying to intervene in that way. So this is a map of Brooklyn indicating the percentage of Black people in each census tract. This is in 2010. There are a couple of areas today that are lighter around the edges, but the contours are generally the same, right? So having lost some 119,000 Black residents since 2000, the borough was still home to nearly 730,000 residents of African descent. And that number is greater than the entire populations of cities like Atlanta, Boston, and Washington, DC. So, you know, when you think of a city within a city, literally Black Brooklyn is that, right? And those sheer numbers, coupled with persistent hypersegregation, as you see, even amidst hypergentrification, has made the neighborhoods that comprise Black Brooklyn home to one of the largest contiguous Black communities in the United States. Brooklyn's status as a destination for Black migrants and immigrants from across the diaspora adds richness and texture to the lived experience of Blackness throughout the borough. Differences along lines of nationality, ethnicity, and region of origin have produced distinctive communities and cultural practices. They've also generated cross-cultural tensions and intraracial strife. Still, Black Brooklyn is home to a Pan-African consciousness and commitment to solidarity born out of shared historic and ongoing experiences of enslavement, internal and external colonialism, and persistent discrimination. And this was a really fun block party, celebrated the 30th anniversary of Do the Right Thing, which that, of course, the scene of Do the Right Thing is totally gentrified now. They did repaint the mural. So those experiences of discrimination have been exacerbated by what scholars Mindy Thompson-Fullilove and Roderick Wallace call a persistent policy of serial forced displacement. So over the course of the 20th century and continuing into the 21st, policies like segregation, redlining, urban renewal, disinvestment, mass criminalization, and the foreclosure crisis have subjected Black Brooklynites and other Black urban communities to repetitive, coercive upheaval. As an expression of structural racism, serial forced displacement has directly and disproportionately heightened Black urban residents' vulnerability to risk and dislocation, perpetuating power and resource imbalances that reverberate in every aspect of urban life. They've also ensured that racism is spatially expressed and that the disciplining, exclusion, and exploitation of Black people and the spaces they occupy remains crucial to the generation of value in other, more desirable parts of the city. This dynamic, which has essentially made racism and anti-Blackness a constitutive element of the social and built environment, is fundamental to current processes of gentrification. So this fatal coupling of race, space, and power brings me to the first key argument of my book and of my research more broadly. So I intervene in class first and class only accounts of gentrification by arguing that gentrification is an economic as well as a racial project, and it builds upon enduring and racialized processes of capital accumulation, dispossession, and spatial containment and marginalization. And ultimately, it reinscribes and deepens existing patterns of racial and economic inequality. And so we can't fully understand gentrification's operation and impact unless we reckon with the role of race and structural racism at the heart of the urban political economy, in the organization and functioning of the urban landscape, and in the distribution of the burdens and benefits of urban redevelopment. And this is the primary lens through which I understand gentrification and its consequences for Brooklyn's Black residents. And next, I argue that rather than present itself as a restoration of old glamour suited to middle-class tastes and desires, the new gentrification erases old histories to make room for the new rich. So as one example of this, I turn to the past, present, and future of Williamsburg's now demolished Domino Sugar Factory. I'm sure if you know Brooklyn, you've heard of Williamsburg, because Williamsburg is supposed to be the epicenter of gentrification in Brooklyn, right? But Williamsburg gone, y'all. So this complex, the Domino Sugar Refinery, or the factory, housed what was once the largest sugar refinery in the world. So in previous eras, factory to loft conversions were standard indicators of gentrification, and they still are in some places, right? We know about these lofts, really nice apartments, you know. But today, gentrification has far exceeded rehabilitation of distressed housing and seemingly spontaneous movement of artists into post-industrial lofts and affordable apartments. And today, it's a systematic, speedy, and vicious process of luxurification, that's a new one, driven by politicians and developers catering to the hyper-rich. So capture this in your mind. That's exactly the reaction I was going for. So this is the master plan for the $3 billion, 11-acre complex that now stands where the refinery once stood, okay? This is the Williamsburg Bridge over there, and you can kind of see it as you're on that side, right? On the FDR Drive or riding across the bridge. And this really encapsulates that, right? That particularly in global cities like New York, where private capital flows are the highest, contemporary gentrification is about creating entirely new urban landscapes. So once a capsule of 19th and 20th century wealth, power, and technology, of immigrant histories, and of racial and class exploitation and struggle, all that remains of the iconic landmark factory building is its exterior shell. a hollowed out red brick facade wrapped around a glass office building. And that image is also, for me, an apt metaphor for the hollowing out of longstanding communities and cultures amidst Brooklyn's ascension to ground zero for gentrification in New York City. I also argue that current modes of gentrification deploy the illusion and politics of multiculturalism and inclusive revitalization while retaining the politics of Black exclusion. So this is where I'm trying to reconcile the rising profile of Black neighborhoods, Black politicians, celebrities, Black popular culture with the intransigence of anti-Black racism and racial inequality. So the Barclays Center Arena is the site that best exemplifies this tension for me. So it's quite literally at the nexus of the shifts I'm exploring. So it's where a booming civic and district, business and civic district of downtown Brooklyn meets first wave gentrified neighborhoods and borders Black Brooklyn. So the Barclays Center is also the preeminent symbol of the new Brooklyn, and accordingly, it embodies what so many people love and hate about the changes that have swept across the borough. I'm really interested in particular in the use of Black popular and mass mediated cultures in the marketing of the arena. And I closely analyze hip hop mogul and former Brooklyn Nets minority owner, Sean Jay-Z Carter's emergence as the arena's most visible ambassador. So Jay-Z only owned 1/15 of 1% of the team, which baffles a lot of people, myself included, but that's right. This is the power of hip hop and Black pop culture at this moment, right? So his market-friendly image of racial difference and oppositional cool generated a great deal of support for the project when a broad cross-section of local residents, Black and white, wealthy and working class homeowners and renters, were against it. His affiliation with the project also promoted a colorblind narrative of neoliberal urbanism in service of capital. Although Carter's Bedford-Stuyvesant roots, and I won't say Bedford-Stuyvesant, that's a mouthful, I'll say Bed-Stuy, y'all know what I'm talking about, okay? His Bed-Stuy roots signal deep ties to local Black communities, but his celebrity overshadowed nearly a decade of protests over the project's displacement of residents and worsening of racial and class stratification in nearby neighborhoods. Using the bootstraps narrative of his rise to the top of the entertainment industry, he cast the arena as the spoils of his entrepreneurial success, which he was returning to share with his hometown, kind of like a Black Robin Hood, right? He also minimized gentrification's role as a process of multiple and overlapping dislocations, instead positing it as a necessary and natural vehicle for progress toward a new and better Brooklyn. Ultimately, his involvement helped divert attention from structural explanations and solutions for urban inequality, consistent with larger trends that transform diversity from a social justice ethic to a marketing strategy and lifestyle amenity. And I borrow that framing from our colleague, Brandy Thompson Summers, who has an excellent book on gentrification in the 8th Street corridor. By recasting arena investors from profit-driven businessmen into benevolent providers of public goods, he also helped obscure the flimsiness of promises of jobs and housing that have remained unfulfilled. And this story really gives me space to critique Black capitalism in the context of gentrification and to demonstrate how Black culture itself is capital, not only as something that can be commodified and put on the market, but also as a mechanism for building community and as a means of illuminating or concealing structural inequality. And here are my final two arguments. So first, I contend that Black communities' experiences with targeted racial, spatial, and economic marginalization have produced unique and cumulative vulnerabilities. And these result in their continued exclusion and disenfranchisement in the context of gentrification. And most critically, I argue that in the face of all of this, Black people have demonstrated immense resourcefulness, ingenuity, and creativity. And I examine that specifically in terms of counter ideologies, formal and informal institutions, expressive cultures, and artistic practices. To illustrate both arguments, I'll turn to an example from the second chapter of my book, which is entitled Becoming Black Brooklyn. On January 15, 2016, members and supporters of the Children of Slaves and Patriots rallied in front of an abandoned movie theater at 1215 Fulton Street in Bed-Stuy. Several groups had recently been protesting the planned demolition of the building. 2 months prior, a Manhattan-based developer had purchased the venue, along with 2 parcels behind it, for $18.5 million. That was a sharp increase from the $2.1 million it had been sold for just 2 years prior. The theater had been out of operation since 1998. Its shuttered gates were a stark contrast to the bright awnings of chain stores and boutiques that had recently opened nearby amidst decades-old mom-and-pop businesses. By the time of the protest, the only sign of the building's former glory was its bold marquee, defiantly emblazoned with the word slave, a large Zulu war shield, and number 1 inside an outline of Africa. After the late Judge John L. Phillips Jr. purchased the old Regent Theater in 1984, he renamed it the Slave No. 1 Theater, so that no one would ever forget our struggles or what we as Black people have gone through, unquote. When it opened, the Slave was the only remaining movie theater in the entire neighborhood and maybe the only major commercial building on that strip to have a Black owner. At a time when many outsiders were afraid to walk the streets of Bed-Stuy, 1215 Fulton Street was a shrine to Black histories and Black futures and a hub for creativity and cultural awareness. In its heyday, the Slave Theater showed films of, by, and about Black people. The venue also played host to local and renowned scholars and historians who regularly held lectures on Black history and culture, as well as a church that rented space upstairs for its worship services. Black vendors sold socially conscious books, incense, art, and food from throughout the diaspora. And ever true to his Afrocentric vision, Judge Phillips commissioned artists to fill the Slave Theater with cultural affirmations and murals of Black luminaries. More than a decade after its closure, portraits of Toussaint Louverture, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and other freedom fighters and cultural figures. You all probably recognize JFK made it. Bruce Lee is on another wall, so we can talk about that. We can talk about that later. Freedom fighters and cultural figures, okay? Hovered over the main auditorium, vivid reminders of the theater's beauty and of the tragedy of its demise. Now, looking at around Bed-Stuy or any major US city for that matter, it's easy to take a shuttered building like the Slave Theater for granted as just another failed small business. That is, if we don't take seriously the concerns of the protesters and other community members who fought to preserve it in its history. I posit the Slave Theater and other homegrown institutions as both symbol and physical manifestation of Black Brooklyn's making and unmaking over the past 50 years. The Slave stood at what literary scholar Houston Baker calls the crossroads of lack and desire, a place at which trenchant forms of structural inequality encounter determined resistance from people who know they're entitled to something better. The theater is also an example of what is at stake as people and institutions are displaced and erased by the speedy and vicious processes of gentrification bounding across Brooklyn. Brooklyn's history is filled with Black communities' efforts to construct home place, and I borrow that concept from Bell Hooks, no matter how fragile and tenuous amidst oppression and domination. Whether formally established through property ownership or by creating formal and informal organizations, institutions, and cultural expressions, Black Brooklynites' home places have been sites for solidarity and resistance to what George Lipsitz calls the cumulative vulnerabilities crafted by centuries of anti-Black racism. The story of the Slave Theater and spaces like it are central to any understanding of gentrification in Brooklyn. Such precarious institutions offer a powerful and poignant reminder of why existing communities like those in Black Brooklyn are worth saving. They also demonstrate what urban revitalization looks like when marginalized people are empowered to engage in myriad forms of redevelopment on their own terms and in their own image. Described by a Newsday journalist in the wake of the 1964 Harlem Bedford-Stuyvesant uprising as a festering sore in the heart of Brooklyn. By the 1970s, Bed-Stuy had emerged as one of, if not the largest contiguous Black community in the nation. In a short time, rising unemployment, poverty, crime, and drug addiction there and in Black belts across the nation will fix a lasting stigma on Black urban residents and the areas in which racialized real estate practices had concentrated them. By 1980, the racial isolation engendered by white flight, disinvestment, and outright prejudice had reached its peak, and the neighborhood's population was 98% Black. That same year, nearly 2,800 vacant residential buildings in Bed-Stuy alone stood as physical embodiments of intentional dispossession, disinvestment, and neglect. What monolithic narratives of decline tend to omit, however, are Black Brooklynites' efforts to transform spaces of deprivation and despair into places of mutuality, community, and solidarity. The Slave Theater was one site where such homegrown acts of resistance and community self-determination boldly came to fruition. In a neighborhood beset with structural ills of such magnitude, establishing a theater was not an obvious solution to the obstacles residents faced. But Judge Phillips, himself a Bed-Stuy resident, believed in his neighborhood and local community's desire to turn their fortunes around. In the absence of much needed support from external public and private institutions, it became clear to him that any meaningful solution to Bed-Stuy's myriad problems would need to, at least for the time being, come from within. For example, he made and financed a movie about an interracial love story that no one would show, so he purchased his own theater. But as a man of means, particularly relative to most of his neighbors, he understood that he was uniquely positioned to make an important contribution to the life of his community. Most Bed-Stuy residents were neither owners of nor investors in their neighborhood, and such powerlessness produced great profit for others. With these facts in mind, property ownership became a chief means by which Judge Phillips sought to strengthen ties to and amongst his majority poor and working class Black neighbors, and to set a foundation for meaningful collective autonomy. Beginning in the 60s, the judge purchased more than a dozen local buildings when their prices hit rock bottom to renovate and rent them to residents who had difficulty finding affordable housing. But the theater, although initially in part a vanity project, presented an opportunity to serve the community in other ways. While the neighborhood of Bed-Stuy was undoubtedly a space of racialized containment and confinement, the Slave Theater became a place where Black Brooklynites could carve out a zone of freedom. No longer simply a movie house, Phillips repurposed it as both concept and physical space. Its existence was predicated upon Black community, culture, history, and ownership, all of which had weathered centuries of entrenched racial, economic, social, and political disadvantage. Literally and figuratively, the Slave became a site of radical solidarity, a shared social space in which Black Brooklynites cultivated mutual recognition and respect in the midst of crisis. In opposition to dominant associations of Blackness and inferiority, the theater enabled self-creation and self-fashioning that fixed racial pride at its core. That love for Black people, Black histories, and Black cultures remained deeply embedded in its mission, its institutional functioning, and as you can see, even in its decor. Most prominently, the theater also offered a forum for addressing the grave sense of lack and scarcity that permeated the neighborhood and served as a venue for public political mobilization. The Slave Theater quickly became a symbol and center of Black activism as a series of racist and racially polarizing events in the late 1980s aggravated already strained race relations in the city. From the murders of Michael Griffith and Yusuf Hawkins at the hands of white mobs in Howard Beach and Bensonhurst, to the notorious Tawana Brawley case and the persecution and eventual prosecution of the Black and Latino teenagers who were then known as the Central Park Five, such incidents magnified the need for Black Brooklynites to forge a unified political voice. The weekly rallies and news conferences held at the Slave helped launch the careers of several young social and political activists and organizations, including the Reverend Al Sharpton, the United African Movement. Speakers as diverse as Mamie Till Mobley, Kwame Ture, and Cornel West regularly appeared before mostly to all Black audiences to lecture on the challenges facing contemporary Black communities and the philosophical and activist strategies necessary to overcome them. As a hotbed of civil rights activity, the Slave Theater also helped to effectively shift the focal point of Black activism in New York City to Bed-Stuy from Harlem. After a Brooklyn Supreme Court justice declared the aging Judge Phillips mentally incompetent, under questionable circumstances, of course, because it's Brooklyn, and as egregious and criminal mismanagement of his estate by court-appointed guardians severely crippled his entire real estate portfolio, the Slave Theater's demise was all but certain. Although after its official closing, the theater remained host to some events and tenants or squatters, depending on who you ask, the city sealed it shut following the 2012 collapse of an outdoor patio, which injured 4 people. Despite the lack of official landmark designation, the theater is undoubtedly a cherished part of Brooklyn's Black history. And like so much of the borough, 1215 Fulton Street is now a development site. In many ways, the success of ongoing gentrification projects necessitates the destruction of institutions like the Slave Theater. The current wave seeks to attract gentrifiers and capital investment into Black and Brown communities, often gesturing toward obvious racial difference or making promises of multiculturalism and inclusion, yet rendering silent the effects of historically rooted racial and class discrimination. And here's a quite literal example of that. This is a previous owner's rendering of the interior of the proposed project that was intended to stand where the slave once stood. So in contrast to something like this, the slave was far from an innocuous and sanitized version of racial difference. It was born out of a refusal to forget the ever-present history of white racism and Black resistance. And just as Black Brooklyn has been unmade by repeated physical, social, and economic dislocations, its unmaking can be found in the erasure of homegrown efforts to fight back. Although the Slave Theater has been demolished, the saga surrounding it is far from over. The Queen's lawyer who was in charge of handling Phillips' estate was sentenced to 3 years in prison for stealing over $500,000 from the estate, including from the funds associated with the multi-million-dollar sale. And I mention that because it also perfectly encapsulates so many of the themes at heart of the gentrification of Black Brooklyn. It speaks to legacies of theft and predation that hit hardest in the borough's Black communities. It speaks to the intentional precarity of Black institutions and property ownership, right? The notion that these things weren't meant to last anyway. And it even speaks to the unique threats facing older property owners in gentrifying neighborhoods who are being targeted with all sorts of schemes and defrauded of their properties by private citizens and government policies alike. So as the site has changed hands, its owners have often been clear about their lack of interest in the community's desires for the future of the building, frequently offering no statement at all. And so in March 2022, the site went for a whopping $33.6 million. And construction has finally commenced within the last year or so, but there's not any clear indication of what the site's going to become. And there was a 99-cent store across the street that's now a Shake Shack. And I imagine it's just going to be a very expensive condo, because that's the way these things go, right? But even amidst intense displacement and gentrification pressures, one thing is for certain. The Slave Theater may be gone, but the dream of Black Brooklyn as a center of Black history, culture, and activism lives on. It lives on in Black Brooklynites' efforts to preserve community institutions like the Weeksville Heritage Center, which highlights the Brooklyn settlement that was home to one of the largest free Black communities in the 19th century United States. It lives on in direct confrontation with landlords and developers and in demonstrations and protest marches in which Black and allied communities lay claim to public and private space and resist their dispossession. It lives on in the fight for environmental justice, including this campaign against a fracked gas pipeline slated to run through Brownsville, the Black Brooklyn neighborhood that is home to the highest concentration of low-income public housing in North America. It also lives on through artistic practice and mutual aid networks, like the ones that have sustained many of us during this time of local and global crisis. It's also worth mentioning that, we know New York City was the first epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, but Black Brooklyn neighborhoods were amongst the hardest hit within New York City. But I had to start writing a book at some point, so that's not gonna make it in. And although it's increasingly difficult for all New Yorkers, right, and all of us to buy homes, right, many Black Brooklynites are determined to purchase homes and foster collective ownership of land rights in Black Brooklyn, not simply to use housing as a vehicle for wealth accumulation, though that is certainly important, but to construct sites for solidarity, resistance, and community preservation. My work talks back to narratives that view Black neighborhoods as problems to be solved or eradicated, or that reduce us to either conduits for or barriers to progress and profit. I analyze policies, institutions, and ideologies that produce gentrification. I illuminate gentrification's human toll, and ultimately, I hope this work helps us to move beyond fear, stereotype, and misinformation to imagine what more livable cities look like for everyone. Hopefully we can discuss that a bit more during the Q&A. Thank you.
That was incredible. What amazing presentation and argument. There are a lot of scholars that still think gentrification is a class-based phenomenon. And Amanda's work really pushes on that and makes us think about the centrality of race and racism within the context of gentrification, its processes, and its outcomes. You're at the cutting edge and the forefront of the gentrification race debate. And the way you presented it is beautiful. So let's open it up for questions, because there was a lot of things said that I'm sure a lot of people want to ask Amanda about. I got my list, but I'm going to hold off. But let's open it up for questions for all of you. We have about 20 minutes, so let's have a conversation. You can moderate. You can call.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much. I really appreciate this. Of course, I really appreciate that you make race and racism central to the discussion about gentrification. So I think that's something that unfortunately doesn't really appear as much in the research, particularly the quantitative research. But I'm really curious about, so right, if race and racism is central to gentrification, I think we can all agree on that. How do you respond to the critique that, well, it's not just white people and white institutions that are engaging in gentrification, right? This notion that in certain spaces we see that, oh, Black people and Black institutions do it too, right? And if both groups can indeed engage in gentrification, if that is indeed true, are the processes in some way different? I don't know if you've happened to sort of come across those critiques and discussions with other people that, push back against this notion of gentrification and how it works, but I just wanted to see how you sort of felt about that.
Sure, thank you for that question. So I think we have to kind of rewind a bit and think about what we mean when we're talking about structural racism, right? And so if we think about structural racism as a system of ideologies and institutions that produce adverse outcomes that disproportionately have a negative effect on Black people and other people of color, then that means that it's not just something white folks do, right? And so we know there are a lot of ways that Black people can, be Mayor Eric Adams. I mean, mayor of any, they can be mayors, they can be executives, they can be US ambassador to the United Nations, and, participate in processes and make decisions that have disproportionately adverse outcomes for people of color. And so I would say that's also true. That's true broadly, but also in the case of gentrification. When we look at the sorts of industries that are involved in gentrification, whether that is, for example, New York City government, a Black person might be mayor, but it's still a white dominated political structure, right? If you look at developers and the companies that are doing these sorts of, projects, these are by and large, white dominated companies. They're also in a global city like New York, where there are capital flows. We can also talk about, foreign influences. For example, A lot of, I believe it is Chinese investors are also a significant proportion of, the foreign investment going on in cities like New York and LA. But these are largely white dominated industries. Again, Black people can participate in them. But by and large, when we talk about these being racialized structures, that doesn't mean that, the white people are the bad guys, right? We can talk about the way that other folks can be involved. And that what you asked also kind of reminded me, folks will ask me, well, what about middle-class Black people? And for me, that is like, well, I would kind of say, what about them? But also, again, the vast majority, first of all, Black people's relationship to middle-class status is very tenuous, partly because our Black folks' class structure is a lot flatter. And so oftentimes when you're middle class or more affluent, you're one relationship out of poverty. So you're also taking care of someone in your family. Somebody might be living with you. You've got, often more student loans to pay. Like there are all sorts of sort of taxes along sort of racial taxes on the way that mean that your middle class status is not backed by the sort of wealth that the typical, person in the white middle class has, right? And so again, it's like, yes, it's important to be aware of these cases and to take them seriously. But by and large, we're talking about what's happening in a racialized structure that produces particularly adverse outcomes for people of color.
Thank you.
That was a very long and winding way of. Sure.
Do you put much of the effort to keep Black people from maintaining neighborhood on the fact that so many Blacks don't own where they live?
I think that is also an important factor to think about, because I'm not arguing, when I say that gentrification is a racial project, I'm not saying that white people are not harmed by it, right? They're white renters, some of y'all in the room, who are having a hard time, making rent on a regular basis, right? But we also have to acknowledge that the Black community is disproportionately made up of renters, right? And that's intentionally so. And then we can also talk about the racialized tactics that landlords have in terms of getting out their Black tenants to make room for ones they desire a bit more, right? That's something that's kind of dear and sad to me because it's happened within my family, right? And so certainly have to acknowledge the lack of ownership, because that helps to basically creates a setting by which that sort of speculation can occur.
Is there a path to a post-gentrification future where we can have urban renewal without pushing out of the neighborhood's original residents?
Post-gentrification sounds apocalyptic. I don't like that. So we're gonna, but no, you're asking about what does redevelopment look like equitably, right? And I think, one of the things that's so frustrating about gentrification and the scale of displacement we're seeing is that these are all problems that humans created. So we could certainly make it so that, disenfranchised people of all backgrounds or people who have historically had more barriers than other segments of the population to home ownership, right? To wealth accumulation. That means that, the home isn't the only thing that you own that, can produce wealth. We have lots of mechanisms where we can make things more equitable, but the political will is largely absent. So there's this great book that's called The Real Estate State, and it basically talks about across Capital City, the real estate state. Is by this guy, Sam Stein, and he really points out, he looks at New York, but he points out how whether you're talking about de Blasio or Bloomberg, both sides of the aisle are beholden to real estate developers. And so that dictates what the approach to urban development has been. And I would say that's one of the big barriers to it. But there are certainly ways that, there's rent control. There is actually enforcing the Fair Housing Act of 1968, because it's been there since 68, but we do have a lot of things in our toolbox now, but the political will has to be there to enforce a society that's actually fair, and to prioritize people having a right to housing, period. Not just, saying, well, if you can't pay to play, then, we figure it out.
Yeah, Dr. Buckner, I appreciate your presence and your presentation. So I have two questions.
Sure.
One, I'm from New York too, right? And so I
I
think
can tell.
Comes out, right? So my first question is, have you or has your work or have you seen in kind of relevant scholarship a way to empirically test harm in Black Brooklyn, whether quantitatively or qualitatively? Because as we know, right, when you're from New York, it is an identity in and of itself. When you're from a borough, it's an identity in and of itself, right? So to be from Brooklyn is very different than to be from the Bronx. So I'm wondering if kind of these patterns, this concentrated pattern of gentrification or disadvantage that you're seeing, that harm manifests itself differently, or the trauma of it manifests itself differently. And then the second question is one of positionality, right? So as a Black Brooklynite yourself, how did you reconcile the trauma that you were kind of reading, and how do you write that up in a way that can give the readers hope, for lack of a better word?
Oh, that's good. Thank you. So when you talk about harm, I think harm manifests in a lot of ways, right? And when we talk about harm in terms of gentrification, oftentimes displacement is the first and only unit, right? Like, did you get kicked out of your house because you can't afford it anymore? But harm also occurs when the world around you is changing. So for example, folks who are in the housing projects, they might be tethered to a place, but it's changing around them. And so it's disrupting their understanding of and relationship to the world, right? And so I think there's just generally a need in the gentrification scholarship to think about harm in particular kinds of ways that go beyond displacement. But I would say when you talk about psychological harm, I'm thinking of Mindy Thompson-Fullalove's work on root shock. And she has a great book about that. And she's actually talking about urban renewal and how it affected Pittsburgh's Hill District. I think she also might talk about Newark. But she gets at that sort of psychological angle. I believe she's a psychiatrist. And so she talks about the psychological angle. So I don't think anyone has done that work in Brooklyn. I would love to. Maybe we can collaborate. But I'm not aware of anyone who's doing the root shock work in Brooklyn. But when you talk about what psychological harm looks like and the disruption of the urban environment, I think Mindy Thompson-Fullalove's work is a good model for that. Mm-hmm. Oh, and then positionality. I mean, it's hard. It's sad. And I didn't pick no job that gave me any brownstone money. So I'm like, it's a difficult thing. But I think one thing that's been important for me, and I'm actually on research leave now working with the arts nonprofit in Bed-Stuy. One thing that gives me heart and keeps me encouraged is coming home, like leaving the book to the side. Maybe I left alone too long. Gotta finish the book. But talking to the people, seeing what people are doing to preserve the history, to build community in the face of all of this, to build connections. You know, I'll have white students at NYU come up to me and say, yo, this is crazy what's going on. How can I be a good neighbor? How can I be like, not be the evil gentrifier? Because I'm having a hard time finding another place to live too, right? And I'm seeing kind of a willingness from people from different backgrounds wanting to attack the issue and really build a better city. And they're resisting kind of the old ways that's just kind of like, well, I got mine, so good luck to the rest of you. So I think like actually going home and interacting with folks and spending summers in Brooklyn definitely gives me a lot of hope. Yeah. Go ahead.
So you had a photo of a community land trust, and
Sure.
I was kind of wondering, like, what you think are some of the main like barriers to expanding community land trusts, and like, you know, just kind of how we can maybe make them a more normal thing and how they can work within like a government system as well.
Sure. So I think that for those of you who aren't familiar with community land trust, it's basically a collective model of land ownership. So the community essentially, I hate to use this word because it's very capitalist, but they essentially become shareholders in the land and manage it together. And it's really about making it so that longtime residents who would most likely not have the opportunity to just go out and buy property at market rate will be able to stay, right? And to, again, preserve the history, heritage, and residency of a particular community. So I would say in a place like New York, frankly, the problem is that the land is so doggone valuable. And so, you know, it's even in East New York, which is like, basically, I hate to say a lot of these things, the new frontier, right? There's actually about to be a new police drama on CBS based in East New York, so. But yeah, so I would say that the land is so valuable that folks snatch it up and don't wanna, give it over for the good of the community. They wanna get top dollar for it and the cycle continues. So I would say one thing that happened, when a lot of these properties, whether it's Brooklyn, Harlem, et cetera, were abandoned, the city took them over and sold them. But even now, the city is like kind of turning them over to developers, right? The real estate industry is advantaged in this particular climate where real estate is so dominant. And so it really would be about a political will that is really about, returning land to the people and not about using real estate as a primary means of generating income for the city. But it's certainly possible. So I think it's about that. So Brooklyn's community land trust movement is still burgeoning. It's still growing. They're still taking a lot of lessons from folks in other cities. So they've got their work cut out for them. I'll be interviewing a couple of folks next week. So that's something I definitely want to go deeper into. But that's the thing. I feel like so much is at our fingertips. Like every problem, most of the problems that we see, it's not rain, right? It's not a natural occurrence. These are problems that we created and we have an ability, and I would say a responsibility to resolve with some creative solutions.
Is there political will without community pressure?
A lot of times there's not community will with community pressure. But I would say, every good thing that our society has, and I'm stretching my mind to think of, but it's all community pressure. And so largely, it's on the people and even when we get the quote unquote, the politicians we want, not to let that pressure up. But community pressure is always the way to any sort of concessions from the power structure.
I actually grew up in Chicago. I actually taught high school in New York City for about 10 years and coached in the very good housing projects in the PSA on Bed-Stuy sometimes. So my question has to do with, you had Hope 6 up there. And I don't know, and this question may not pertain to your study, so if it doesn't, just go ahead and ignore it. But in Chicago, the Hope 6 project had a lot to do with gentrification because there was just a massive amount of housing projects. And when I coached in the PSA and other stuff, my kids did live in housing projects, but they were better than the Chicago ones. So I don't know if Hope 6 affected New York in the same way it affected Chicago. So did that have any role in this process of gentrification in the same way or contribute to it?
No, not really. So the Hope 6 program, basically, the idea was that, public housing is out of control. We just need to destroy it and replace it with mixed income housing. And so you would see that at massive housing projects. Like you said, Chicago has some of the best examples, places like Cabrini Green, if y'all Good Times fans, and sort of, those kind of superstructures. And they were knocked down, replaced with mixed income housing. And oftentimes, you can imagine, you had a lot of crime and stuff like that, but you also just had regular working people who called it home and had built community over generations. And so, and those communities were not guaranteed housing in the new developments. And so there's a lot of, again, that sort of root shock, that harm that goes on when your world and your social environment is completely disrupted. So Hope 6 was on the list because it's in the Mindy Thompson Full of Love reading. I wanted to put that there, but Hope 6 did not take effect in New York City in that way. And that is one reason that the housing projects are so interesting in New York in particular, because there's a feeling that you're not just gonna destroy the projects, but you do see, air rights being sold so that people can build really high buildings near the projects, or you have the land, the common space around the housing projects in New York being sold, or just maintenance needs being outsourced to private companies. But thank you for bringing that up. I hope 6 wasn't a huge issue in New York, and I hope that was done very poorly. So I hope that's not, that doesn't become a factor. Yes.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak with us.
Of course.
I'm curious to know if in your research you observed sort of other strategies for placekeeping and sort of disrupting gentrification from like other diasporas that are facing gentrification. Like in Brooklyn, I specifically think of like a lot of the movement that's done to face gentrification in Puerto Rico, and like it's Brooklyn's proximity to the Bronx. So a lot of people are being displaced from there to the Bronx. So I'm wondering if like those movements are influencing or informing each other in any way.
So do you mean just people who can't afford to live in Bosure are moving to the Bronx?
Yeah, so like,
Yeah.
are like movements sort of like influencing each other? Like, are they taking strategies for placekeeping against gentrification,
Yeah.
sort of like using those same strategies?
Well, so I would describe that movement, and I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say. But I am, a lot of people will ask, well, what happens when a neighborhood is gentrified? And what happens to the people? And I say they go where they can afford to go. So for somebody that might be moving from the, sort of Puerto Rican little San Juan in Bosure, which is South Williamsburg, which is actually the area near the Domino Sugar Factory. They'll move to Puerto Rican communities in the Bronx, those enclaves. So, I mean, you could look at that as placekeeping. Others might look at that as displacement, right? Because then what happens when it spreads? Because, you got the hip hop museum coming to the South Bronx and all that. And so, but I think if you're talking about people who, rather than just leave the city altogether, they move to where similar groups are, then certainly that's going on, right? Folks are moving from Bed-Stuy to Brownsville. They're moving from Bed-Stuy to Canarsie, which is south of Brooklyn. I mean, in South Brooklyn, south of Prospect Park. So it's actually where I'm living in an area called Flatlands now. It's still 80% Black. And part of the reason that it's still majority Black is because there's no train that goes past a certain point. So it's just harder to get to, right? So in terms of that strategy of moving to another ethnic enclave, yeah, that happens. But something I've also, and especially with my time at this nonprofit, this is just really far back, isn't it? Okay, so for example, they'll move, this is Black Brooklyn basically. So they'll move from, for example, Bed-Stuy to Flatlands. You're from Canarsie, right, Kadeem?
I went to elementary school there.
Okay, well, that's my childhood friend. We've known each other for like 25 years this year, which is amazing. But anyway, so, but something I've loved working with an arts nonprofit while I'm on leave is seeing like artists and how they engage in placekeeping. So again, what does placekeeping look like if we think beyond the market and property ownership, right? It might look like, collecting oral histories. It might look like photography and, artistic production and all sorts of ways to build community and collective neighborhood power that defy market logics. And so I think that's going on with the folks who are being, again, displaced and dispossessed, but who retain their love for their community, their identification with that community. And I think that, again, that defies a sort of physical displacement. I think that's really the experience of diaspora, right? Did that answer your question? Okay.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
I'll make it quick then. Thank you, Dr. Moss, for your research. I think sometimes this stuff gets thrown into one pot because sometimes people who might be called displaced actually move to a better neighborhood. And I'm talking about the district. Everyone talked about the white flight that happened, but there was a whole lot of Black flight too. And you can talk to Maryland about that. And some of those folks made a whole lot of money. I was able to pay off my student loans because I moved to a neighborhood that was developing and stayed there for 12 years and then moved out of it. And I was able to pay off my student loans. So it's not all displacement of people being pushed out. Some folks are making money. So we can't have it both ways where we say, all right, owning a home is the way to build wealth in America. We have a whole lot of Black folks who own homes in the District of Columbia, and they've made a lot of money or stand by to make a lot of money on their homes.
Oh, that's definitely true. And some people, particularly again, in a global city like New York, you might make more money than you would have ever hoped to see in your life by selling your home and moving elsewhere. All of these stories aren't in terms of moving because things are expensive. They're not all sad stories. My parents, they retired. They're like the children of the Great Migration. There's a whole generation of Black folks in New York who got their good government jobs and they're taking their pensions and they're moving down south where they can live like kings in their McMansions, right? But I'm concerned, so I'm interested in that, but I'm concerned about what's left behind, right? And so what does it mean that you're moving down south and you're selling this home for the value you can get, which is probably not what it's worth, right? It's a depressed value because you're a Black homeowner and either they've seen that in the pictures in your house or it's the neighborhood you live in, right? But what does it mean that no Black person will ever live in or own your home again? So I like to think of these, the individual stories matter, but I'm really also concerned with the collective and the structural reality that's produced through these changes.
Thank you.
What's the last question? One more question?
So we're going through two stadium renewal issues in DC. So I live close to the former football stadium, RFK Stadium. And then we also have our basketball team in Capital One Arena in Chinatown, if you know Chinatown in DC. They're allegedly leaving and going to Virginia. And so I guess my question is, what lessons should we take from the Barclays Center experience for DC as we're thinking about what to do with these huge plots of land that are in really central parts of DC, in my opinion?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I would almost say, like, look at St. Louis after the Rams left for LA, right? Because when they sell you the arena, they're telling you it's really for, we just love the city so much and you guys need this. And then when they realize they can make a buck somewhere else, they're gonna leave, and they're gonna leave y'all with the bill. Because sometimes folks, they leave the city with taxes even after the facility has been demolished, right? And so I think that, you know, you gotta hold people accountable. You know, remember who was in the room when it was time to vote for the stadium after all the people protested or whatever? Remember that, hold them accountable, but also I think you're kind of gesturing to, like, now that this has happened and we know it doesn't work, what can we do with this space, right? And then engaging in some organizing around that, right? Because oftentimes it's public, it might be publicly owned land. It might have been something seized with eminent domain. That's the case of the Barclays Center. The area was cleared and seized through eminent domain. So it's technically owned by, you know, New York State. And so you might see what the loopholes are to think about a more collective model of ownership rather than some corporate landlord who really is about a buck and not about the well-being of the city. So, yeah.
All right. But thank you for your presentation and thank you all for being here. The gentrification and race conversation is going to continue next week here at the same time, same place. We have Jeffrey Parker, who is going to be presenting. We're going from Brooklyn, New York City to Bridgeport, Chicago. And he's going to be presenting on Bridgeport, which is a white stronghold, working class community the dailies come out of, but it's being gentrified with upper income African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. So it's definitely a shift in terms of how gentrification is unfolding, and it's different than the Brooklyn story. So I hope you all come next week to hear Mr. Parker in his presentation. It should be a really good one. So again, thank you for being here, and you know, let's keep the conversation, keep it going. Thank you.